Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are opening up uh, a really remarkable document. It's a white paper that goes far beyond the daily news, the battlefield reports.
Oh, absolutely.
It lays out a highly detailed blueprint for how the war in Ukraine not only ends, but, how you actually achieve stability after an armistice.
Which is the part that always gets forgotten, right?
The acting.
Yeah.
Exactly. This is not just a conversation about stopping the shooting. This is, and I don't think this is an overstatement, a complete proposal for a massive, maybe unprecedented shift in European security architecture. It's all designed to stabilize the eastern flank, maybe permanently.
That's exactly right. And I think the unique thing about this proposal is its methodology. It's not just theory. It's deeply rooted in history. It's drawing lessons from two very specific, very durable geopolitical solutions. First, the 1953 Korean armistice, and second, the post-World War II Allied zoning of Germany. It takes those historical benchmarks, which, successfully froze conflicts and allowed for long-term recovery, and uses them to design a new military and political system for Ukraine.
So it's looking at what's worked before in really tough situations.
Precisely. The core assumption here is that long-term stability has to be built on a certain institutionalized international commitment. It can't just be left to an exhausted Ukrainian military.
Okay, so let's unpack this. For you, the listener, our mission today is to give you an intellectual shortcut into this very complex world.
Yeah.
We're going to try to understand why this radical security structure, this new kind of buffer zone, is, according to the paper, strategically mandatory.
Yeah.
We'll look at what military and demographic risks it's trying to counter, and then get into the real details of how this proposed three-tiered defensive model would actually operate along a future military demarcation line, or MDL.
We are diving deep into what the authors see as the necessary price of a durable peace.
So let's start where the document starts, with what it calls the strategic center of gravity for the West. And I have to say, it was a bit of a surprise to me.
It probably is for a lot of people. It's the preservation of the current Western-aligned Ukrainian government's legitimacy.
Its legitimacy.
Yes. The number one strategic objective for the U.S. and NATO isn't just stopping the fighting. It's making sure that the existing Kyiv government remains viable, stable, and credible to its own people.
That sounds, on the surface, purely political. But the source insists this is a fundamental strategic requirement, not just, a preference for one side. So why does the legitimacy of the government trump something like, say, holding a specific piece of terrain?
Because without that legitimacy, the entire Western effort, decades of it all collapses from the inside out. This government, you have to remember, was forged in the crucible of the Orange Revolution of Maidan. It represents Ukraine's 30-year commitment to a Western path. So its survival depends entirely on how the populace interprets any armistice agreement. And that agreement will undoubtedly include some painful territorial concessions.
It has to.
It has to. So the key is that the people see it not as a capitulation or a failure, but as a necessary pause. A pause for integration into, the Euro-Atlantic structures. A pause that lets them redirect their national energy. But if the populace looks at that deal and sees a surrender, well, the internal political consequences are instantaneous and disastrous.
And this is where the paper brings in a really chilling historical analogy, the Weimar risk. Comparing a modern democratically elected government to the collapse of the 1918 German Empire. It seems a bit overwrought at first glance. Why does the paper argue this specific parallel actually holds up?
It holds up because the mechanism of political collapse is terrifyingly similar. The November criminals analogy, that whole stab-in-the-back myth, it refers to the widespread perception in Germany after World War I that civilian leaders had betrayed an army that was supposedly undefeated in the field.
Right, that the politicians lost a war, the generals were still fighting.
Exactly. And the fear here is identical. If the Kyiv government signs a peace deal that trades territory for security guarantees that then prove to be flimsy, or if the demilitarization requirements look like they're just being stripped of their ability to defend themselves,
then the narrative becomes one of betrayal.
It becomes a narrative of betrayal. Our soldiers, our fathers, our sons gave everything, and the leaders in Kyiv gave it all away for nothing. That is a politically toxic and potentially fatal narrative.
And the consequence of that perceived betrayal isn't just, a peaceful change in government in the next election cycle. It's the immediate creation of what the paper calls a radicalization vacuum.
Precisely. In the immediate, raw aftermath of an unpopular peace, that political vacuum gets filled, and it gets filled by extremists. And the document is very clear. This isn't exclusively a risk from, say, pro-Western radicals.
No, it warns of both sides.
It equally warns of ultra-nationalists who feel the deal wasn't nearly tough enough, or, on the other side, pro-Russian fatalists who conclude that the entire project, the whole European experiment, was a dangerous, catastrophic failure.
So either way, you get extremists who reject the current moderate Western-aligned government.
Both sides reject it completely. The center cannot hold.
You know, let's focus on a demographic element here, which I found particularly insightful. The paper really highlights the 35 to 55-year-old male demographic. This is the group that has borne the heaviest losses, done the bulk of the fighting. If this specific group feels betrayed, what is their reactionary alignment likely to be?
Well, they might completely reject the ideals that they've been fighting for, the ideals of the Orange Revolution, of Maidan. They could look at the past 10, 15 years of Western alignment and conclude that it brought them nothing but war, instability, and hardship.
And that leads to a deep cynicism about the whole project.
A very deep cynicism about democracy, about European values, and crucially, they might pivot toward what they perceive as the stability of the Russian model, a sort of Soviet-style conservatism or a strongman regime, simply because it promises physical security and predictability over ideals that seem to have failed them.
So that demographic shift, if it turns against the current pro-Western trajectory, it fundamentally changes Ukraine's long-term future, regardless of who's sitting in the capital at that moment.
It changes everything. It undoes decades of policy.
So if that political structure does collapse, the worst-case scenario unfolds, which is Russian absorption. The paper is incredibly blunt about the pure attritional conflict model. It suggests that Russia's massive manpower advantage, especially when you couple it with the vital economic insulation provided by China.
Yeah, that's key.
It makes a Russian victory highly likely within the next 5 to 10 years if the war just continues on its current path. It basically becomes a matter of math, not strategy.
That is the core finding of the paper's military modeling, yes. And the impact of a Ukrainian collapse would be, well, it would be devastating far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Russia wouldn't just gain territory and infrastructure. They would emerge from this conflict with what the document chillingly calls a super military.
A super military. Okay, we need to spend some time breaking that concept down. What makes this potential Russian force super?
It's a synthesis of experience and captured resources. First, the veterans. Russia would have absorbed, retained, and battle-tested vast numbers of soldiers who have fought continuously for years. They'd be operating sophisticated Western systems while also adhering to their traditional Soviet doctrine of mass.
So they'd have this entirely new level of combined arms experience.
Tested against a very determined Western-supported enemy. Second, and this is maybe even more important, the technology. They would likely gain huge amounts of captured Western tech, everything from advanced communications gear and sensors to, potentially critical components of missile systems.
Which they can then analyze, reverse engineer.
And incorporate those elements into their own design programs. So instead of being a conventional top-down Soviet-style force, they become this hybrid monster. They're equipped with Western knowledge, but battle-tested against NATO doctrine, all while retaining their own advantages of scale.
It's the worst of both worlds.
Exactly. They would have experience fighting modern coalition warfare, blending high-tech capabilities with their mass. This would fundamentally undermine, just shred, many established NATO contingency plans all across the eastern flank.
It would force the alliance to immediately and massively increase its own defense spending.
And forward deployment commitments, just to get back to the previous balance of power, the cost of a Ukrainian collapse extends far, far into NATO's future budgets and strategy. It's not a contained event.
And let's not overlook the immediate humanitarian cost. The paper describes it as a crisis that could destabilize the entire European Union.
It warns that a full collapse would trigger a mass migration event into the EU on a scale we've rarely seen in modern history. It specifically draws a comparison, suggesting the scale could potentially exceed the post-Castro Cuban exodus or even the Syrian migration crisis of 2015.
Wow.
We are talking about millions of displaced persons hitting EU borders almost simultaneously. And this isn't just a humanitarian tragedy, it's an immediate economic shockwave. It would result in massive social and economic destabilization across Germany, Poland, and other key EU states.
So the strategic imperative to prevent that political collapse in Kyiv,
Yeah.
it's actually a matter of core national security for multiple NATO members.
It is absolutely a matter of self-interest for Berlin, for Paris, for Warsaw.
Okay, so the goal is political stability, but that stability has to be underpinned by just irrefutable security guarantees. So we have to look at the military reality of what a peace deal would likely impose on Kyiv. The document highlights something it calls the coastal enclave trap. This sounds deeply dangerous.
It is. The trap stems directly from what Russia will almost certainly demand in any successful negotiation: the severe reduction of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the AFU, to a constrained defense-only force.
A cap on troop numbers.
A hard cap. The paper estimates the negotiation cap could be as low as 100,000 personnel. This constraint is specifically designed to cripple Ukraine's long-term offensive capability and really its strategic depth.
And that troop cap is the root of this trap. It immediately brings up another sobering historical precedent the paper uses: the Chiang Kai-shek precedent.
This is a really critical analogy, this one, from the Chinese Civil War. After World War II, the U.S. pressured the nationalist forces, led by Chiang Kai-shek, to adopt a defensive posture and reduce their strength.
Okay.
Well, the reduced nationalist forces, they managed to hold the major coastal cities, but the Maoist communist forces, they controlled the countryside. They controlled the infrastructure, the supply lines. They didn't need to launch a huge frontal assault on Shanghai.
They just starved them out.
They simply strangled the cities into submission, cut off the power, the food, the communication.
And the lesson for Ukraine here is chillingly clear. A small, constrained AFU cannot possibly manage the dual threat problem. They can't simultaneously defend a very long military demarcation line and secure the vast rear areas against internal subversion and economic warfare.
Exactly. They would be stretched far beyond the breaking point. If their entire strength is committed to holding the MDO, then major economic centers like Kyiv, like Kharkiv, and especially the port city of Odessa, they become incredibly vulnerable to Russian hybrid warfare tactics.
So we're talking about internal sabotage, targeted assassinations.
Or more likely, something less dramatic but just as effective: economic strangulation. Russia would retain the leverage to basically collapse the Ukrainian economy at will, even during a truce, just by disrupting key supply chains and power grids deep in the rear.
So the truce would just be a slow-motion collapse.
It guarantees it. The lack of security ensures it.
The conclusion, then, is inescapable. To counter that troop cat and prevent the economic strangulation, the burden of defense must be shared. It has to be a coalition defense in-depth model.
It absolutely must. This shared burden would utilize formal bilateral or trilateral security agreements involving strong foreign partners. And the reason for that is simple. The immediacy of a full NATO Article V guarantee is politically uncertain, during an armistice phase.
There'd be debate. It wouldn't be instant.
It wouldn't be instant, but the defense of the MDL has to be certain, legally binding, and immediate, regardless of what the broader NATO consensus is at that moment.
Which brings us to the inspirational model for all of this, the strategic benchmark of the Korean Armistice of 1953. Right. This is the template for the entire proposed DMZ structure.
Korea is really the perfect case study for turning a military stalemate into a geopolitical and, more importantly, an economic success story. The 1953 establishment of the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, and that clear military demarcation line, that provided the security architecture that allowed South Korea to transition
from a totally devastated, war-torn state into a global economic power.
A global economic powerhouse.
So how did that clear line and the commitment of the U.S. and UN forces, how did that specifically help South Korea's economic development? What was this resource economy effect the paper talks about?
Well, the stability provided by that U.S. Triple Air Force, it was a reliable security guarantee, and that allowed Seoul to make a crucial, monumental decision. They could redirect vast national resources away from just military survival,
right,
and channel them into capital investment, into education, into infrastructure development. If they had been forced to maintain a hyper-militarized economy where, 60–70% of the national budget goes purely to military readiness, they never would have had the capital or the human resources to fuel the miracle on the Han River.
So the DMZ commitment from the U.S. effectively subsidized their security.
It did. It freed up the national capacity that was required for that explosive economic growth.
So the goal is to stabilize the military flank so Kyiv can focus on building its legitimacy through reconstruction, which reinforces that initial strategic imperative we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly. It all connects. The 1953 line, remember, it's still not a recognized sovereign border. but it provided long-term clarity. It prevented the large-scale resumption of hostilities for over 70 years. And that durability, that certainty, is the strategic takeaway the paper wants to import to the Ukrainian context. Draw a line so clear, so well defended, that the cost of breaching it is understood by all parties as immediately and prohibitively high.
Okay, this brings us to the actual structure of the multinational force itself. The proposal introduces what it calls the sector model, and it explicitly draws on the Federal Republic of Germany's solution.
This is a direct operational reference to how the Allied powers managed West Germany after World War II. So instead of a single, slow-moving, large, multinational command, which can get very bureaucratic.
Right. Very complex.
The defense responsibility is compartmentalized. Specific partner nations would assume responsibility for distinct, defensible geographical sectors along this rectified MDL. It just improves responsiveness and simplifies logistics.
And who are the key nations that are identified for this role? And what's the specific nature of their mission?
The paper names France, the United Kingdom, and Poland as the core partners, potentially Spain as well. And their mission is strictly and singularly defined to maintain a purely defensive posture.
So they're deterrence and reinforcement force.
Exactly. They are deployed to prevent the resumption of hostilities and to intervene immediately if Russia breaks the truce. It's very important to state they are not an occupation force. Their presence is guaranteed by these bilateral treaties we're about to discuss.
And this leads us to what you called the most crucial operational detail in the whole plan, the 30-day rule. We need to spend some significant time unpacking the implications of this because it seems to define the entire logistics chain and the political commitment that's required.
The 30-day rule is the absolute bedrock of the deterrent. It means that the forward-stationed coalition forces, the French, the British, the Polish Corps, must possess the organic logistical and combat endurance to support the Ukrainian defense for a full 30 days.
1 month.
1 month of high-intensity conflict, completely unsupported by external resupply or relief from the broader NATO structure.
30 days is a very specific time frame. Why that length? What's the strategic logic behind that particular number?
It serves multiple purposes. First, it ensures the immediate response is certain and totally self-sufficient. It means an initial Russian breakthrough can't succeed just by outpacing the coalition's initial logistics chain, which is a classic blitzkrieg tactic.
Right, outrun their supply lines.
Exactly. Secondly, and this is politically crucial, it buys time. It buys crucial time for the political processes within NATO to unfold. If the conflict can be contained by the forces on the ground under these bilateral guarantees for a full month, it prevents the conflict from instantly escalating to a full NATO Article V decision within the first 72 hours.
Which is the nightmare scenario.
It's the worst-case scenario. It decouples the immediate military response from the ultimate political decision-making of the entire alliance.
So logistically, what does this actually demand from, say, a French corps that's deployed in one of these sectors? I mean, we are talking about maintaining massive stockpiles of fuel, high-grade artillery ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies.
Yeah.
All of it organic to the force, deployed outside their own national borders.
That's it, exactly. This requirement, it dramatically exceeds current NATO readiness standards, which often rely on rapid reinforcement from rear staging areas in Germany or Poland. The 30-day rule mandates a full push package capability.
A push package?
We're talking about pre-positioning thousands of tons of Class V munitions, so everything from 155mm shells to advanced guided rockets and fuel reserves, sufficient to maintain a motorized force that's operating continuously for 4 weeks. It requires heavy, self-sustaining corps-level deployments capable of fighting independently. This is a massive, multi-billion-dollar logistical commitment from each of those participating nations.
And a commitment on that level requires a bulletproof legal architecture. You can't just have informal agreements when you're talking about deploying heavy maneuver units into immediate high-intensity combat.
Correct. The legal framework is the backbone of the entire thing. The paper stresses the necessity of formal, binding, bilateral or trilateral mutual defense treaties.
Between Ukraine and these specific guarantor nations, France, Poland, the UK.
Yes. These are agreements that exist outside the main NATO treaty structure, but they're designed to complement it, to be a first responder.
And the key word there is obligate, isn't it? These treaties must legally obligate not just the foreign political leaders in their capitals, but specifically the subordinate military commanders on the ground to engage.
Precisely. There can be no gray area. The treaty must grant pre-authorized kinetic engagement authority. If a breach is verified in the French sector, the French corps commander on the ground must be legally and militarily obligated to engage the aggression immediately.
So it bypasses the need for a phone call back to Paris for permission.
It eliminates political hesitation. It eliminates a parliamentary debate that could delay the counterattack by hours or days. The response has to be automatic. That certainty is the deterrence.
To make that immediate kinetic response defensible on the world stage, the treaties have to mandate deep intelligence and attributability. You can't just start shooting without clear evidence.
The attribution mandate is vital for international legitimacy. The guarantor nations must share high-fidelity, instantaneous intelligence to establish irrefutable evidence of who initiated the violation.
So this is data from sensor arrays, drone footage.
All of it. Signals intelligence, satellite imagery. This is the crucial component for justifying a kinetic response to the UN Security Council and the international community. If the evidence of aggression is ironclad and immediate, the response is viewed as legitimate defense, not as an escalation.
All right, so let's look at how this coalition defense in depth is actually implemented physically on the ground. Because this isn't just a line on a map, it's a layered defensive structure. It's designed to absorb and progressively degrade any enemy breakthrough.
The system is defined by 3 distinct consecutive zones, and each one has its own rules of engagement, its own occupant, and its own primary mission.
Okay, Zone 1, the sensor fuse buffer. This is the actual demilitarized zone, the DMZ. Let's start with the geometry of separation here.
The total width of the DMZ is 30 kilometers, and the zone is deliberately symmetrical. 15 kilometers east into Russian-held territory and 15 kilometers west into Ukrainian-held territory. It's centered exactly on the Military Demarcation Line.
Why that specific width? 30 kilometers total, 15 on each side?
It's all dictated by weapon kinematics. The 15-kilometer depth on each side prevents standard tube artillery, which has been the workhorse of this conflict, from firing directly across the line into the opposing side's main defensive belts in Zone 2.
Ah, okay. So it forces them to move their guns forward.
It forces any aggressor to physically move their assets forward into the buffer zone, which immediately alerts the defense and exposes them to the most dangerous part of this entire architecture.
And this zone relies heavily on sophisticated technology. You mentioned the establishment of a pattern of life, or POL, via advanced sensor arrays. Can you describe the kind of technology we're talking about here?
In peacetime, the zone is physically anchored with things like concrete obstacles and terrain modification, but its real teeth are the sensor networks. We are talking about a fusion of acoustic sensors, seismic detectors, thermal cameras, and low-flying automated drones that are up 247.
And they're all working together to establish a baseline of normal activity.
A constant baseline of movement and activity, that's the pattern of life. Any deviation from that established norm, say a column of tanks moving at 2 a.m., provides instant, high-fidelity indications and warnings INW that are required to mobilize the human element of the defense.
If that pattern of life is violently broken, the high-tech deterrence kicks in. The paper calls it the purple kill box concept. This sounds extremely automated and extremely lethal.
It is the ultimate expression of deterrence through technology. The purple kill box is simply the wartime status of this autonomy zone. Purple, in military terms, signifies the integration of air and ground assets.
Okay.
In this case, it's specifically coalition autonomous systems. So if hostilities commence and are verified, this entire 70-kilometer-wide area immediately activates. It allows for simultaneous engagement by air assets drones, close air support, and surface-to-surface assets artillery and loitering munitions without the normal delays of command coordination.
So let me get this straight. Once an enemy force is detected moving into that 30-kilometer buffer during a verified breach, they are automatically classified as hostile. And the coalition's automated systems can open fire simultaneously from the air and the ground. It's an instant technological gauntlet designed to maximize attrition.
The goal is to make crossing the MDL an incredibly resource-intensive and potentially suicidal endeavor before the attacker even reaches the first line of human defense. The purpose of Zone 1 is not to hold ground. It's to immediately degrade, attrit, and slow the invading force down, buying crucial hours for the fixing force to mobilize and the strike force to prepare its counterattack.
Okay, so moving 15 kilometers back from the MDL, we hit Zone 2, the Ukrainian holding sector. And this area extends 30 kilometers deep into Ukrainian territory.
This is the primary defensive line. It's held by the constrained Ukrainian Armed Forces, the AFU. But the crucial political concept that defines this zone is the Civilian Control Line, or CCL. This is a direct import from the South Korean model.
Which means civilians are still permitted to live and work here, which maintains critical economic continuity, but they're living under extremely strict conditions. How does the paper balance civilian life with military necessity here?
It focuses on GLOC preservation ground lines of communication. It ensures railways, major highways, and pipelines remain active, supporting the national economy. However, residency there is strictly conditional.
So what are the requirements?
The requirements include mandatory, hardened civil defense infrastructure bunkers for every community, integrated warning systems, and a populace that is trained for rapid mobilization or rapid evacuation. This is not a safe zone. It's a functionally operational wartime zone where the populace is an integrated part of the defense ecosystem.
And the AFU's mission in this particular zone is defined as being the fixing force. What does that mean?
Their role is, in a strategic sense, sacrificial. They are designed to absorb the initial breach, they fix the enemy in place, and they protect the civilian infrastructure as much as they can. Their job is to absorb the shock and the attrition of the main assault, using extensive field fortifications and prepared positions. They're buying that necessary 30 days of time for the heavy maneuver element, the coalition corps, to deploy and strike.
And those heavy hitters, they're positioned back in Zone 3, the coalition reinforcement sector.
Correct. This zone begins 30 kilometers or more behind the MDL, which strategically positions it outside the standard range of even heavy Russian artillery systems.
What is the coalition corps' mandate here? Why are they positioned so far back from the fight?
They provide the strategic depth and, more importantly, the decisive maneuver element. They are the operational strike force. They remain outside the immediate firing lines to preserve their capability, to preserve their combat power. Their mission is to launch the heavy counterattack required to decisively destroy any Russian breakthrough that manages to penetrate the Ukrainian fixing force in Zone 2.
So this is where the self-sustaining UK, French, and Polish corps with their 30-day logistics packages would operate from.
That's their staging area. From there, they move forward to strike.
So when a violation actually occurs, the speed and the certainty of the response is the entire point of this architecture. The paper details a tiered response mechanism. It's designed to provide an immediate conventional defense while rigorously controlling the path to broader NATO involvement.
It's a very carefully managed escalation ladder designed to deter from the outset.
Okay, so step one is the immediate, non-negotiable direct response.
Coalition forces, acting under those binding bilateral defense treaties, engage hostilities immediately in their assigned sectors to repel the breach. This requires zero external consultation, zero political debate. The response is instantaneous, and it is kinetic.
Step two is the diplomatic and political trigger, NATO Article IV.
Right. Verified aggression immediately triggers NATO Article IV, which is the mechanism for formal consultation among all member states. But crucially, because the sector partners are mandated to share that high-fidelity attribution intelligence, all NATO members are consulting with irrefutable, near real-time evidence of the violation already in their hands.
Which should streamline the whole consultation process significantly.
It should, yeah.
This then moves swiftly into punitive measures, designed to raise the cost of aggression on multiple fronts at the same time: military, economic, and diplomatic.
The paper outlines specific mandatory actions. First, the required snapback of all lifted sanctions against Russia must occur instantly. This removes any economic incentive Russia might have gained from the armistice in the first place.
Okay.
Second, there's immediate coalition censure of Russia in the UN Security Council and the General Assembly, which is aimed at eroding Russia's diplomatic standing. And third, the full mobilization of the Ukrainian reserve forces, which signals Kyiv's absolute commitment to resisting any further attacks.
So the idea is that the punishment is not slow. It's immediate and it's compounding, making the continuation of the attack fiscally, politically, and militarily prohibitive.
Precisely. The goal is rapid de-escalation by creating an intolerable cost barrier for the aggressor.
The ultimate deterrence, naturally, remains NATO Article V, the Collective Defense Clause. But the document is very clear that the actual working deterrence rests on the conventional response.
Article V is, it's the nuclear option. It's the ultimate contingency. But the day-to-day functional deterrence rests entirely on the certainty and the speed of the immediate conventional coalition response under those bilateral and trilateral treaties.
So the fact that the UK, France, or Poland will engage instantly with heavy, self-sustaining forces rather than waiting for a consensus in Brussels.
That is the factor that modifies Russia's strategic calculus. That's what makes a resumption of hostilities too risky to even attempt.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the architecture surrounding the MDL, but now we have to address the line itself. The paper is clear. The MDL is the political and military zero line. It's derived from the rectified forward line of owned troops, or FLOT. And crucially, it's a line of control, not a recognized sovereign border.
That legal distinction is everything. It provides the clear legal reference point that's necessary for the enforcement architecture to function without prejudging the ultimate political status of the territories. It's a ceasefire line that guarantees security, which allows the political discussions to continue, for decades if necessary, just as they have in Korea.
Phase one of creating this line involves the rectification criteria. The paper calls it the straightening logic. Why can't we just, use the current position of the front line as it is?
Because the current FLOT is a mess. It's jagged, it's riddled with salients, and it's incredibly resource-intensive to defend. The methodology applies specific filters to rationalize the line, to turn it into a long-term, sustainable defense.
Okay, let's look closely at the defensibility filter. This is about making tactical adjustments that will save lives and resources over decades.
It focuses on two main actions. The first is salient elimination. For listeners who might be unfamiliar with the term, think of the front line like a frayed edge of a piece of cloth. A salient is a deep pocket or a bulge in the line, and it's surrounded on three sides by the enemy. It's just impossible to defend efficiently.
So salient elimination means you trade those indefensible pockets.
You trade that indefensible dirt for a shorter, straighter, and more secure line that preserves your manpower and your resources.
And the second action is terrain anchoring.
This is just using natural geography to secure the line. You anchor the defense on features like hydrology, so major rivers, deep wetlands, and high elevation, like ridge lines. This maximizes your interlocking fields of fire, it provides natural barriers, and crucially for the high-tech DMZ, it maximizes the sensor lines of sight for that autonomy zone.
You want continuous, clear lines of sight for all your advanced monitoring systems.
You have to have them.
Then we have the viability filter, which looks beyond just pure military defensibility and focuses on the economic survival of the truncated Ukrainian state.
Economic continuity is paramount. It goes right back to maintaining that political legitimacy we talked about. The line has to be adjusted to ensure all vital ground lines of communication, the GLOCs, specifically the heavy rail lines and the main highways, remain contiguous and fully within the Ukrainian holding sector. If your rail network is constantly interrupted by the line, your economy starves.
And the requirement for maximizing buffers around gateway security airports and seaports is fascinating, specifically to ensure commercial insurance viability.
This is absolutely vital and often overlooked. International shipping and commercial air carriers will not return to Odessa or to Kyiv's international airport if the front line is too close to be deemed safe by global insurance providers like Lloyd's of London.
Right.
The paper mandates that the MDL must be drawn far enough away to guarantee that these gateways are considered commercially viable. That's what allows the influx of foreign investment and export revenue that's needed for reconstruction. If the ports are uninsurable, the economic collapse is guaranteed, regardless of the military outcome.
Finally, phase two, the urban decision matrix, where the MDL inevitably bisects or abuts a major city. The coalition faces three difficult but predetermined choices.
And they have to be predetermined because trying to negotiate these things under fire is impossible.
Choice one, the fortress city.
This applies to cities of paramount strategic importance, so a political capital like Kyiv or a major industrial hub like Kharkiv. The action here is must hold. To ensure its economic and political viability, the MDL has to be pushed forward aggressively to the city limits, plus that 15-kilometer buffer zone, ensuring maximum standoff distance from artillery.
Choice two, the contested hub.
This would be a city that is currently split by the fighting, or one that is utterly ruined by artillery, or is maybe economically marginal to begin with. The action here is to demilitarize. The city itself becomes the gray zone or the autonomy zone. It's occupied by neither side.
So it's administered neutrally.
Administered neutrally, designed solely to prevent further fighting over ruins and to allow humanitarian aid to flow in. It avoids a bloody, pointless urban battle. And then there's choice three, strategic withdrawal.
This applies to a city that creates a dangerous, indefensible salient in the line. The action is cede.
This is the hardest political choice, but it might be militarily necessary. Forces must withdraw to more defensible, terrain-anchored positions behind the city in order to shorten the overall line, conserve manpower, and maintain the strategic integrity of the whole defense. It's about trading a symbolic victory for long-term survival.
This proposal it's just staggering in its depth. It moves seamlessly from the political risk of the Weimar analog all the way to the specific technological demands of the purple kill box. The core achievement, it seems, is this dual strategic goal: certain deterrence married to necessary political cover.
I think that's a perfect summary. The deterrence is achieved through the technological shock and awe, the self-activating sensor arrays, and the immediacy of that conventional coalition response. But the political cover, which is arguably the most vital ingredient of all, is secured by the Kyiv government demonstrating that they have successfully leveraged the commitment of powerful, self-sustaining European allies to defend their territory.
And that allows the government to survive the transition from a desperate war to an integrated peace.
It's the only way they survive it.
Ultimately, this layered DMZ architecture, modeled after the successful economic recovery of Korea, it frees Ukraine from that crushing need to maintain a resource-intensive, hyper-militarized economy that's focused purely on survival. It allows for that critical shift toward economic recovery and reconstruction.
Which is the only thing that can truly legitimize the current government in the eyes of its own populace in the long run. And if we connect that layered defense architecture back to its most tangible commitment, that rigorous 30-day rule, the commitment that certain European allies must possess the forces, the logistics, and the political authorization capable of fighting unsupported for 1 month on foreign soil, that raises a really important and I think provocative question for you, the listener, to consider.
Okay.
What does that highly specific, self-sufficient commitment signal about the future of military alliances outside of the formal, complex NATO Article V structure? Does this level of pre-authorized immediate defense actually create a stronger, more reliable military guarantee than the existing treaty framework? And how does that redefine the very concept of a reliable coalition of the willing in modern European security?
It seems to signal that the price of certainty in defense may be a smaller, tighter club of hyper-committed partners acting independently but in coordination with NATO. That 30-day requirement is, at its core, proof of commitment, which is exactly the commodity that Kyiv needs most. That's a fascinating final thought for today. Thank you for diving deep with us. We will see you next time.